introduce you to cloud computing. In this section, I'm going to introduce you to cloud computing. Don't forget, you can follow along with me by using the webpage associated with this lesson. Now, I've been in the tech industry for over 25 years, and let me tell you, we love our buzzwords. Words like AI, big data, Internet of Things, 5G, and a lot of these terms don't make clear what they actually mean. The cloud is one of those terms. What do you think about when you hear the term the cloud? You may hear things like, you should migrate to the cloud, or your data is in the cloud, or you can work in the cloud. Well, let me tell you, I'm sure you know by now, the cloud has nothing to do with white fluffy things far away somewhere in the sky. When your data sets and applications live in the cloud, they're not somewhere in the wind. The cloud is a real place. Your data is stored somewhere. In fact, the cloud can really be servers anywhere, in your data center or someone else's. Servers are very powerful computers that handle your requests. So whenever you access a simple website or an app or a complex web application, maybe one that has online ordering, there's a server or many servers behind the scenes. Now, AWS has thousands and thousands of servers grouped together in what's called a data center. Now, these images here show you what some of the data centers look like. If you want to read more about AWS's data center, you can click here on the Read More button, and I've linked you to the AWS website. Now, let's take a closer look. When you use these servers, you can deliver your applications over the internet. And that's essentially what cloud computing is, the delivery of computing services over the internet. Think of it as a different way of storing data and sharing applications. Instead of on your local machine or in your internal data center, you're using AWS's servers. And AWS provides many high-level services to help you access and share your data and applications with others. So you'll hear a category called compute. So there are compute services like EC2 and Lambda. And if you want to read more about the compute category, simply click on Read More. There are networking services. You'll hear about VPC and Direct Connect. Storage services, S3 and EBS. Analytics services like Athena and Redshift. Development services, now this is my favorite category, Cloud9 and Code Commit. And security services like IAM and Macie. And database services like RDS and DynamoDB. Now there is a very important white paper. It's called the Overview of Amazon Web Services. When I was studying initially for the CCP certification exam, I read this white paper front to back. So I definitely recommend that you read this in full before the exam and then review it again the day before your exam. And it's 72 pages. It lists all of the AWS services broken out by category. And when you click on Read White Paper, it will bring it up for you. To maximize the use of their servers, AWS allows you to share a single server with other AWS customers through virtualization. Now, virtualization is at the heart of cloud computing. Virtualization divides the hardware resources on one single physical server into smaller units called virtual machines. It's really cool when you think about it. Each VM or virtual machine is its own little server, complete with its own operating system, memory, storage, networking access, and you have this VM all to yourself. Now, I bet you're thinking, well, how do I use these VMs and how do I pay for them? That's a great question. It's like your usage is placed on a meter. Think about a water meter or a gas meter or an electric meter. Cloud providers like AWS operate just like power companies. It's such a novel idea. Now you have on demand and pay as you go, and you pay only when you access the services and only for what you use. On demand, you have no long-term commitments or upfront payments. And with pay as you go, you pay by the hour or sometimes down to the second for only what you use. Going into the exam, make sure you remember the categories for each service. For example, Lambda and EC2 are compute services. We'll learn more about all of the different services and categories later. And don't forget to read the white paper, Overview of Amazon Web Services. I know it's 72 pages, but believe me, you'll need to read through the entire thing before taking the exam, and then I recommend just reviewing it the day right before your exam. When you're ready, please join me in the next lesson. Today, I'm going to teach you about the advantages of cloud computing. Don't forget, you can follow along with me by using the webpage associated with this lesson. In the last lesson, we learned cloud usage is on demand and pay as you go. Now, there are several benefits to this approach. Many companies either don't have the money or don't want to spend the money, time, and resources on building and maintaining their own data center. They just rent from AWS, and literally at the click of a button, they can stand up servers. So the first benefit is you're able to go global in minutes. AWS has servers all over the world, and you can easily deploy your applications to multiple regions at the click of a button. The second is you stop spending money running and maintaining data centers, so you're able to focus on projects that differentiate your business, not the infrastructure like servers. You also benefit from massive economies of scale. AWS, they actually aggregate usage from hundreds of thousands of customers, so they achieve higher economies of scale, and then they pass those volume discounts on to you, which gives you a lower pay-as-you-go price. Next, you have increased speed and agility, which essentially means a faster time to market. With cloud computing, you have new resources available at the click of a button, so from weeks to now just minutes. And that allows you to innovate more quickly and deliver your applications faster. Next, you're able to stop guessing about capacity. Now, in the past, companies ended up sitting on expensive idle resources or dealing with limited capacity. Now, your capacity is matched exactly to your demand. And you're able to trade capital expenses for variable expenses. So what does that mean? Instead of having to invest heavily in data centers and servers up front, before you know how you're going to use them, with the cloud, you pay for what you use instead of having to make those huge upfront investments. So now Alfredo can focus on coming up with new innovative recipe ideas or building an app to sell his pizza online. And when he's building that app, he'll have low upfront costs and the ability to reach customers around the world at the click of a button, instead of having to maintain servers or hiring people to do it. Let's put the benefits of cloud computing into technical terms that you'll need to understand for the exam. Now, these terms are very important going into the exam. The first term is high availability. A highly available system is one that operates continuously without failure, meaning it's always up and running. And when you design a system that's highly available, you design it to avoid loss of service by reducing and managing failures. The next term you'll hear is elasticity. Now, when you hear this term, think about growing and shrinking like a rubber band or pizza dough as it stretches. It's related to capacity. For example, you provision servers, and provision just simply means to set up or create or deploy. You provision servers or you take away servers based on demand. You don't have to plan ahead of time how much capacity you'll need. And as you're learning AWS, you'll hear a lot of services have the word elastic in their name. And I tell you, sometimes it's hard to keep it all straight, but by the end of this course, you'll be really comfortable with all the terms and services. Next, number 3, there is a term called agility. And you'll hear that the cloud gives you increased agility. Well, AWS, they have a ton of services that help you innovate faster and gives you a faster speed to market. And then you'll hear the term durability. Durability is all about data and data protection. Will your data be there tomorrow, or will it be corrupted, missing, or in an unusable state? AWS actually guarantees durability. Down here, I've included a link to the ACG blog. There's an AWS terminology cheat sheet. I think it's a very helpful blog post to read to help you quickly come up to speed on some of these terms. Capital expenditures, CapEx, versus operating expenses, OpEx, have different implications for cost control. Let's talk about capital expenditures, or CapEx, first. Capital expenditures are upfront purchases toward fixed assets. So things like equipment, property, computers, and software are all considered capital expenditures. Now let's talk about operating expenses. Operating expenses are funds used to run day-to-day operations. So things like research and development, employee salaries, rent, and marketing. So it's important that you understand the differences between the two. Going into the exam, make sure you understand the 6 advantages of cloud computing and understand how the cloud saves you money. And don't forget the cloud terminology that we reviewed. Remember high availability, elasticity, agility, and durability. When you're ready, please join me in the next lesson. Welcome back. We are going to discuss cloud computing and deployment models. Don't forget, you can follow along with me by using the webpage associated with this lesson. Now let's talk about cloud computing models. There are actually 3 different service models, and you choose the model based on your business requirements. Now, AWS actually offers all 3 of these models. The first one is infrastructure as service. Think of this as the most basic, fundamental building blocks that can be rented. So a service like Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud, or EC2. Think about it also in terms of web hosting, where you pay a monthly subscription to have a hosting company serve up your website. The next is software as a service, or SaaS. This is a complete product that is run and managed by the service or software provider. So in AWS, think about a service like SageMaker, which is their machine learning service. And in the real world, think about your email provider. So your personal email that you access through a web browser, that's a SaaS product. And we have platform as a service. Now, this is a cloud-based environment typically used by developers to build and deliver applications without having to install anything. On AWS, think of a service like Cloud9, which is a developer service. In the real world, think about building a storefront website and a service provider giving you the tools to do that. Lastly, there are 3 cloud deployment models. And the first one is called a private cloud, or on-premises. This is your company's internal data center, and just everything runs in your internal network, like your databases and your servers, etc. Now, this deployment model doesn't offer any of the advantages of cloud computing that we just talked about, but there is an increased level of security, and your infrastructure resources aren't shared with other organizations using that virtualization that we talked about. The next one is the public cloud. This is AWS. You aren't responsible for the physical hardware, and you gain all of the advantages of cloud computing that we just discussed, like increased agility. You benefit from massive economies of scale, no huge upfront investments, etc. And lastly, we have the hybrid cloud. Now, this is a combination of both private and public cloud. And you may be thinking, why in the world would anybody want to do that? And that's a great question. I've seen architectures, and this is a picture of it, where companies keep highly sensitive data in their own private data center, but the app that reads that data runs in AWS, and they're able to talk to each other using a service provided by AWS called Direct Connect. Let's review what we've discussed. We talked about the three models. Infrastructure as service, remember that's the basic building blocks that you can rent, like an EC2 instance. Next, we talked about software as a service. That is a complete product or application. And platform as a service, these are tools typically used by developers to build applications. We also talked about deployment. We talked about the private cloud. Remember, that's your internal data center. It's also called on-premises. We talked about the public cloud. That's AWS. And we talked about the hybrid cloud. That's a combination of private and public. And the architecture that we reviewed included keeping sensitive data in the private cloud and the application reading that data in the public cloud, and the two talking to each other using Direct Connect. Things to remember when studying for the exam. Going into the exam, make sure you understand the three common cloud computing models and also the deployment models. Make sure you can explain the differences and understand that hybrid deployments are supported by Direct Connect. When you're ready, please join me in the next lesson. Welcome back. Let's talk about the AWS global infrastructure that's available to you. Don't forget, you can follow along with me by using the webpage associated with this lesson. In this lesson, you'll learn about regions, availability zones, and edge locations. Alfredo's Pizza is going global thanks to the AWS global infrastructure. Now let's talk about regions. A region is a physical location. For example, here in Orange, we have the Northern Virginia region, and we have the Ohio region. Now, these two regions fall within the U.S. East geographic location. AWS logically groups its regions into larger geographical areas for ease of management. So we looked at the U.S. East geographical location. There's also U.S. West that has several regions, South America, Africa, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Now, when deploying your applications, you want to select a region that is closest to your users because it improves the user experience so they'll see faster downloads and response times. You just don't randomly select regions when you start deploying your applications. So if all of your users lived in the Asia Pacific geographic location, then you would not pick regions in South America to deploy your applications to. Let's look at characteristics of regions. Now, each region is spread out and fully independent and isolated from other regions. So let's say there's a flood or a tsunami or earthquake in one region, the other regions will not be impacted. And because of this, sometimes it makes sense to deploy your code to multiple regions. Another characteristic is regions are resource and service specific. So when you're in the AWS console, you'll see that you'll have to select a region before you start deploying your applications. Now let's talk about availability zones. What is an availability zone? It's one or more physically separated or isolated data centers, and it actually contains the servers that you're renting, and it's where you provision your resources and deploy your applications. Let's look at the Ohio region. Remember, this is in the US East geographic location. So within the Ohio region, there are actually 3 availability zones, 2A, 2B, and 2C. And in Northern Virginia, there are actually 6 availability zones, US East 1A through US East 1F. Let's look more closely at the Northern Virginia region. Within the Northern Virginia region, there are 6 availability zones. Let's look at availability zone 1A. Okay, in this availability zone, there are 2 data centers. Now, I have searched and searched, and I cannot find official documentation where AWS tells us exactly how many data centers exist in an availability zone. So what I'm showing you here is just for illustrative purposes. Let's look at 1B. 1B actually has 4 data centers. 1C maybe has 3. 1D, 2. 1E, 3, and 1F. So this just gives you an idea. Just remember going into the exam that an availability zone has multiple data centers. Now let's talk about the characteristics of availability zones. First, they're physically separated and they use different power grids. That's one way they are isolated. Now they are connected among themselves within a single region through low latency links. AZs are fault tolerant. Like I said, if one AZ goes out of service, the other should not be impacted. And AZs allow for high availability. Now that's a word that we discussed in our prior lesson. If you distribute your applications across multiple availability zones and one zone fails, your application should still run because it's running in another AZ. Now let's talk about edge locations. What is an edge location? Well, first of all, you can just look at this map and see that there are way more edge locations than availability zones and regions. And you can think of an edge location like a mini data center, but it's not used to launch resources like EC2 instances. It's used to cache your content. And this is made possible through CloudFront. So edge locations actually reduce latency and speeds up the delivery of your applications. Now, what is latency? Let's take a look at that. Latency is basically the amount of time it takes for your website to load. So it's the time that passes between a user request and the resulting response. Low latency is always a good thing because it means your website is loading faster. So whenever you hear the term high latency, just remember that is not a good thing because that means it takes a long time for your website to load. Now let's have a quick review. Today we talked about regions. Remember, a region is a physical location in the world that contains availability zones. So think of a region like a collection of availability zones. And you should set up resources in regions closest to your users to improve the overall user experience. And don't forget, most resources are tied to a specific region. Availability zone, that's a collection of one or more data centers. and it contains the servers you're renting, and it's where you deploy your applications. And an availability zone is associated with one single region, so they don't span regions. And we wrapped up with edge locations. Don't forget, an edge location is used to cache your content to speed up delivery. And this is made possible through Amazon CloudFront. And the whole point of an edge location is to reduce latency. And you can think of it like a mini data center, but it doesn't run your main infrastructure like EC2 instances. It mainly caches static content. And we'll dig deeper and talk more about Amazon CloudFront in a later lesson. Things to remember when studying for the exam. Don't forget that multi-AZ deployments provide high availability. And systems that are highly available are dependable, and they continuously operate without failure. And don't forget, an AZ has multiple data centers. It's a collection of data centers. And a region is a global construct, and it has 2 or more availability zones. And edge locations ensure low latency by placing content closer to your users. And don't forget, there are more edge locations than regions and availability zones. When you're ready, please join me in the next lesson.
Hello, Cloud Gurus, and welcome to this lesson on exploring your AWS account. In this lesson, we're going to walk you through the AWS Management Console, which is the most popular way to provision and view resources in your AWS account. We're going to describe what a root user is. We're going to introduce you to the AWS command line interface, where you can programmatically interact with your AWS resources. And finally, we'll review what we learned. As I mentioned before, the AWS Management Console is the #1 most popular way to interact with your AWS resources. It supplies an intuitive user interface that allows you to navigate to various services and provision resources in the AWS cloud. Many different types of people use the AWS Management Console. If you're new to cloud or experimenting with a new service, the AWS Management Console might be the place to start. The AWS console is also great for non-technical roles. If you just want visibility on the AWS resources that exist in an AWS account, you'll probably be doing so through the management console. And technical roles. If you're building things in the AWS cloud, there's a good chance you're doing it through the management console. Now, let's talk about the root user. Your AWS account can have many users. You can invite other people to come and collaborate on work in a single AWS account. But there's also one user to rule them all. The email that you use to initially create your AWS account will be associated with your root user. This is the user that brought the AWS account into existence, and it's also the only user that can completely delete the AWS account, including all the resources that you've provisioned. For that reason, it's very important to keep the root user secure. It's best not to use the root user for day-to-day tasks in your AWS account, and it's highly suggested you protect your root user with multi-factor authentication, which you can do from the IAM service. Now that you understand the core concepts of the AWS Management Console, let's hop over to a short demo where we'll explore its most important features. This is the AWS Management Console, and you'll spend a lot of time here while you're learning the ins and outs of AWS. As you can see on the very front page, you get a few things. You can see your most recently visited AWS services, as well as some getting started information. The newest console home allows you to add and remove widgets so you can put whatever you find the most useful on your console home. If you wanted to explore all the services that AWS has to offer, you can click in the upper left hand here on the Services button. This opens up a huge menu containing all the different categories of services AWS provides. So if I were to click Compute here, you can see services like EC2, Lambda, and Lightsail. If you're looking for a particular service, it can be really overwhelming to navigate this menu. I'll typically use the search bar at the top to find a particular service I'm looking for. In this case, I'll go to the service IAM, or Identity and Access Management. As you can see, I have one major security recommendation, and that's to add MFA for the root user. Because I'm not logged in as the root user, I can't take this action, but I can alert my administrator and let them know that MFA should be added. This is also where you could add additional IAM users to your AWS account. Now, if you wanted to navigate back to that main console page, you would do so by clicking on the AWS icon in the upper left-hand corner. So here we can see our familiar console home with the widgets we've chosen. Now, there is one more thing I wanted to show you before we end this demo. I'm going to search for the service VPC, and I'll click here to go to VPC. One thing that will already be provisioned in your AWS account will be a default VPC. This will include a VPC, 6 subnets, some route tables, and an internet gateway. Now don't worry, we're going to cover all of these things in more detail in a future lesson. But I just wanted to show that these things are provisioned by default. When provisioning EC2 instances or other services that require a VPC, they will tend to default to this VPC unless you create a separate one. Another important note that can be a sticking point for many people who are new to AWS is understanding regions. When you're looking at your resources in the console, it's important to understand which region you're operating in. As you can see, I'm currently operating in the North Virginia region, or US East 1. When I'm in US East 1, only those resources I've provisioned in this region will be visible to me. If I wanted resources in multiple regions, I'd have to navigate to that other region and then create resources there. As you can see, there's also a default VPC in this region, but it is a separate VPC. Now I'm going to navigate back to US East 1 because that's where I want my resources to exist. That's it for this short demo on the AWS Management Console. As you can see, it's pretty easy to click around and explore new services, so don't be afraid to hop in here and give it a try. If you want to learn more about the AWS Management Console but aren't ready to create your AWS account yet, I encourage you to check out the AWS Cloud Playground that's available to you with your subscription. Next, I want to talk about the AWS Command Line Interface, or CLI. This is another way to interact with your AWS resources just like the console. However, the big difference here is that you're sending commands which trigger APIs through your terminal. For the most part, the CLI has all of the same features that exist in the AWS Management Console. But sometimes new features are available in the CLI before they develop the user interface in the console. The CLI is also typically used by developers or other technical resources. The CLI gives you something called programmatic access, meaning you can use code to define actions that take place in your AWS account. You can also achieve this in another way. Of course, there's the command line interface, which allows you to manage AWS services from a terminal by sending commands, but you can also make changes in your AWS account in your application code by leveraging SDKs or software development kits. Software development kits are packages that you can include in your application's code base that allows them to make changes to your actual AWS account and the services within. This is very powerful and requires pretty advanced technical knowledge. For the purposes of this course, you just need to understand that you can gain programmatic access to your AWS resources through the CLI or software development kits. Now, let's review what we've gone over in this lesson. First, let's talk about the root user. The root user is automatically created when you open your account. You should always activate multi-factor authentication, and typically you shouldn't use the root user for day-to-day operations. The console is one way for you to access resources in your account. It's a visual, point-and-click interface that makes provisioning AWS resources really easy and accessible. And the CLI. The CLI is one form of programmatic access that gives you powerful and fast control over the AWS resources in your account. The major drawback, of course, being that you don't get that visual interface. So what do you need to know for the exam? It's very important to understand what a root user is and how it's different from a typical user. You can add many users to your AWS account, but there will always only be one root user. The root user has unlimited power to change your account settings or even delete your account altogether. It's also important to understand the CLI as an alternative to the management console. I hope you enjoyed this lesson on exploring your AWS account. This has been David Blocker, and when you're ready, please join us for the next lesson.